it was just sort of through the PhD process that I discovered I actually really like doing research. I thought I would really like teaching. And it's funny because it was just a career that I had not really thought about before, kind of stumbled upon in a way and discovered that I really liked it. And in a way, I guess after having done a bunch of things that I discovered I didn't like as much, it was refreshing and exciting to have sort of landed in this world which I was really excited about. So maybe it took me doing all of these things to sort of get here and appreciate and truly enjoy what it is we do.
So it is my pleasure to introduce our rising star guest for today, true rising star of the strategy field, Vanessa Brabano. She serves as assistant professor at Columbia Business School, earned her doctorate at UCLA. Her research focuses on socially responsible and irresponsible business practices, as well as the intersection between corporate strategy and the public good, meaningfulness at work, human resource management and motivation. And she serves as an editorial board member at Organization Science, has won a number of awards, including the International Association of Business and Society Best Paper Award, a finalist for the Industry Study Association's Best Paper Award, and has been selected as one of the 40 under 40, the Poets and Quants 2019 list of the best 40 business school professors under 40. She's really tearing up the journals, doing amazing stuff in terms of publications. In her short career, she already has 2 articles in Organization Science, as well as publications in SMJ, Management Science, OBHDP, and California Management Review. And interestingly, her research has garnered a lot of media coverage, including in the New York Times, Financial Times, Fortune, and Forbes, and has gained a lot of traction in terms of impact on other researchers, as indicated by a rather high number of Google citations. So please join me in welcoming Vanessa Brabano.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm sorry. So thanks for joining us, Vanessa. Really appreciate you playing along with our little celebrity talk show ritual.
Pleasure to be here and do this.
So, I like to start out these interviews by asking people how they got into this crazy field that we call strategy professor. I've never heard a 10-year-old say, I want to be a strategy professor when I grow up. You've had a prior career as a consultant and I guess an investment banker. So maybe tell us a little bit about how you got from there to here.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I certainly was not the 10-year-old who always knew that they wanted to be an academic professor. I was not the 20-year-old who always knew that they wanted to be an academic professor. I think I sort of went through trying a few different careers, trying to get closer and closer to the thing that sort of felt right and that I was most passionate and excited about. And it took me a while to get here, to be honest. I worked as a strategy consultant for a while at Monitor Group, which then became Deloitte Consulting. I loved that experience in the sense that I really liked presenting to clients and I liked sort of the strategic thinking aspect of it. But I knew pretty quickly from my experience there that it wasn't something I wanted to do for forever. It was a nice sort of stepping stone. After that, I felt like I wanted to have a little bit more impact, social impact. So I moved to Goldman Sachs as an associate, but not as an investment banker. Actually, I moved to their foundation. So I was involved in sort of their charitable giving, their CSR efforts, essentially, which is part of what piqued my interest in what I sort of study now. And I remember at my time at Goldman, we would present to the board, and we would say things like, our employees really value and care about these programs. And I remember thinking, we think that, but have we really, rigorously shown that? I'm not sure. The types of studies and things like that would be done within a company to try to sort of bolster those types of claims are not like the type of research that we as academics would do, to sort of say, yes, we've nailed it. We've really shown convincingly that this is the effect that this has. So that was always sort of in the back of my mind, doing that. But I found it really fascinating. It was a really fun job. I loved my experience there.
Just curious how you got that job. I mean, how does a 25-year-old, get a plum job at running Goldman Sachs? Well, not running, but at least participating in running Goldman Sachs's CSR and philanthropy programs.
So I applied. They had an opening. I had heard about it somehow. I applied. I had done some work as a consultant that was somewhat relevant.
Okay.
On some of my consulting projects, and yeah, they gave me a shot. They gave me an associate position, and I just, I sort of started there and really enjoyed it, and had a lot of great opportunities there as a result.
Great. Okay.
Then after that, I still was sort of trying to figure out exactly what I wanted to be when I grew up, even at that point. And so there I thought, what seems to really motivate me, I think, about this job is this sense of impact. I want to have more impact. So I thought I wanted to go into government. I thought I wanted to go into policy. So I did a policy degree. I went to Princeton's Woodrow Wilson School of Public Affairs. I did a master's in public affairs. During those 2 years of the degree, I decided I did not want to go into government. So checked that, crossed that off of the list.
So what was wrong with government?
For me, I found that coming from the private sector, it just seemed so bureaucratic and so sort of slow. And from a person who had wanted to sort of potentially pivot that to feel like I was making more impact, I found that seemed not to be the best way if that's what I wanted to do. To me, the private sector just sort of moves more quickly, and I felt like you could potentially do more things through that avenue. So I crossed that off the list.
Okay. So far we've checked off consultant,
foundation work,
checked off government. Okay. Big process of elimination for a decade.
And so, to be honest, when I decided to do a PhD, I wasn't certain that I was going to stay in academia. I decided to do a PhD in strategy and study what I had always sort of been interested in, which was this sort of social aspect. So I'd always been, I was sort of drawn to the sort of private sector for-profit side of things, but I always had this interest in sort of social impact. So I figured I'll do a PhD and I'll study the intersection of these things.
Okay.
And to be honest, I didn't think I would necessarily go into academia. I sort of figured, well, if I have a PhD, I could always go back to the foundation world, or I could go back to sort of the private sector, focus on this specifically, and probably be very happy doing that. And then it was just sort of through the PhD process that I discovered I actually really like doing research. I thought I would really like teaching. And it's funny because it was just a career that I had not really thought about before, kind of stumbled upon in a way and discovered that I really liked it. And in a way, I guess after having done a bunch of things that I discovered I didn't like as much, it was refreshing and exciting to have sort of landed in this world which I was really excited about. So maybe It took me doing all of these things to sort of get here and appreciate and truly enjoy what it is we do.
Right. There's that line from the play, The Zoo Story, about how sometimes it's necessary to go a long distance out of the way in order to come back a short distance correctly. Sounds like that's the story with your adventures and journeys. Yes. So, okay. So why UCLA then?
So in part because of co-location issues with my partner. So my husband works in finance, and at the time that I was doing my master's in public affairs, he was doing his business degree at Wharton, an MBA at Wharton. We graduated in the same year in 2009, and he wanted to take an offer at PIMCO, which is headquartered in Newport Beach, California. And so I sort of narrowed in basically on programs in that area, and within that set was really excited about the UCLA Anderson program, which was it was a little bit more econ leaning, and that was something that was sort of intriguing to me. And yeah, so I had a good experience there. I feel like you know, a lot of where I end up seems now in retrospect to be sort of a combination of a lot of other factors that weren't necessarily like, I always knew that this is what I should do, and so I followed this path to get there. But sometimes that's just how things unwind. But it worked out really well.
Right. So, you know, of course, I know a lot of alumni of the UCLA program who have done great things. You know, obviously, you know, one of my best friends, Russ Koff, you know, Anne-Marie Knott,
Yep.
Who else? Tammy Madsen,
Mhm.
and I'm sure I'm forgetting numerous others. The impression I get from talking to those folks about the UCLA program is that it's kind of unstructured, relatively speaking, compared to other PhD programs, and it's more of, you know, you have to kind of find your own way and forge your own path through the wilderness as a UCLA PhD student in strategy. Was that your impression too?
I think so. I think, you know, relative to, in comparison with other PhD programs that I've now gotten to know or seen sort of in more depth, that are more of sort of an apprenticeship model where you come in and you have an advisor from day one and you work on their research, and then you work with their data sets, and then you do something sort of similar to what it is they do, and then you go out into the academic world. It's distinct from that. And I think it is, as you describe, it's a little bit more entrepreneurial in a way, more independent. You have access to advice. You are given a good sense of what sort of, for lack of a better word, you know, rigorous causal empirical research looks like, and then you try to figure out how to do that in the domain that you're interested in. And for me, I was always interested in corporate social responsibility and these types of issues. I ended up, you know, Marvin Lieberman and Jason Snyder were the co-chairs of my department. Jason had some interest in this topic, but it's certainly not, you know, really what he focuses in. It's certainly not what Marvin does. But they were great advisors and sort of teaching me what type of research I should be trying to strive to do, and then my job was to figure out how to do that and what I was interested in. So I ended up finding, you know, Magali Delmas was in the Institute of the Environment at UCLA, so I sort of found her as someone who was really topically aligned in what I was interested in, and she was a great resource in terms of pointing me to sort of, you know, conferences I should go to and research and sort of things to be aware of in the space. But yes, the program is certainly, it's a little bit more entrepreneurial, it's a little bit more independent. And I think as a PhD student, sometimes that can be more difficult. But I will say that now on the other side, so now that I have a job as a faculty member, I kind of appreciate it more than I think I realized at the time, because you have been doing this sort of more independently since your PhD program. So then when you're a faculty member, you just sort of continue with that.
Right. It's a more accurate representation of what the ultimate job is like.
Exactly.
And so on the other hand, it's kind of a short on-ramp in some sense, kind of an abrupt, yeah.
Yes, that's right. And you know, if you look at like UCLA grads tend to have more solo authored work when they come out of the program. Again, just because a lot of it was, you're sort of your own like, independent work at the time. So yes, I think all PhD programs, and whenever I talk to people about, that are choosing between different PhD programs, I always say every program has sort of its pros and its cons,
Hmm.
or what could be benefits or drawbacks. And I think what matters a lot is the fit between the individual and the program that they go to. So if you were at that program and you were a person who was not going to enjoy the sort of independent nature of it, it would probably be really tough. But I actually really liked it. I was sort of, I was a little older. I didn't do my PhD right out of undergrad, so I
Right.
had all this, prior experience, and I sort of felt like I kind of knew who I was, and coming from that perspective, it was for me, it was really enjoyable to sort of be given a lot of free reign about, well, okay, you know who you are, you know who you want, what you want to research, figure out how to do that rigorously, and then we will back you.
Yeah, I think the people who, excuse me, have been successful coming out of that program are people who knew when they went into the program what they wanted to study.
Yeah.
Like Russ Koff, he had this experience as a consultant to do valuations of human capital intensive firms, and ultimately that's kind of what he winds up studying
Yeah,
is
that's true.
you know so I think if a program like UCLA's maybe works better for people who know before they get there what they really want to study. Yeah.
I think that's probably right. It's funny because you think, oh, 5 years is a long time, for a PhD program, but it goes quickly. All of a sudden, you're sort of past the classes portion. And so I think I agree with you, Rich. If you've always sort of had an idea of what it is you want to do, then you sort of go along that, and it's a great program, I think, for people like that. But I think it is tougher if you come in um, looking to explore and figure it out over the course of 5 years. I think it's
Hmm.
tougher. Absolutely.
And to get a lot of specific guidance about
Yeah.
here's some direction for you, specific,
Yeah.
maybe direction, guidance, maybe even the wrong word, just direction.
Yeah. I think
Yeah.
that's right.
So so tell us a little bit about, okay, so you came in there with some idea of what you wanted to study. First of
Mhm.
all, just remind us all what your dissertation topic was, and tell us a little bit about the journey to get to that topic.
So I had always been interested in studying some sort of strategic implication of corporate social responsibility. That's kind of what I got to Anderson. That's what I wanted to study, and I was trying to figure out how to study it. And one thing that I sort of encountered a lot in trying to figure out how to study this topic is, again, coming from the UCLA program that has a very strong focus on causal identification and research. One thing that came up a lot as I would sort of say, oh, well, maybe I could use, for those of you who aren't aware, sort of commonly used CSR data sets are like the KLD data or the Asset 4 data. They're essentially sort of
Right.
firm level aggregated CSR scores that researchers can get access to. So when I first started, I was sort of, okay, these are the data sets. I'll look into these. Let me try to figure out what I can do with these to sort of get at something that I'm interested in. And one thing that was always a challenge was trying to figure out how to use that to tell a causal, well-identified story, which was very important at UCLA. Like trying to figure out how to do that was a very important feature. And so I kept sort of trying to figure it out. I couldn't figure it out. I couldn't figure it out. And so I was sort of thinking, well, maybe I should think of some other way. Maybe this data isn't the way to go about this. And I had been attending other seminars at UCLA, and I happened to attend a lot of marketing seminars, the marketing MD seminars, where experimentation is like so common. I mean, almost all of their presentations are basically experiments. And I had seen some sort of field experimental work at more econ seminars. And so I remember thinking, well, I wonder if there's something like this that I could do here to try to get at this. And I'd always been sort of interested in the employee angle, how these types of CSR programs influence employee behavior because of my time at Goldman.
Right. Right.
And so that was something that sort of had always been back of mind. And then I remember kind of having this idea of, oh, maybe an experiment is the way to get around this causal identification issue. And then looked into, in marketing, they use Amazon Mechanical Turk a lot for experiments. But it hadn't been so commonly used as sort of to just observe worker behavior. And then that's when I became interested in sort of these work platforms, essentially. So there's Amazon Mechanical Turk, and then there's things like Upwork and Elance and Odesk that essentially match employers to workers. And then, these workers go about their work as they would any other type of job on this platform. And then I became really excited about the idea of, oh, well, maybe this is a way that I could implement an experiment. I can essentially randomly assign the thing that I want to study, which is a message about the social responsibility of the employer. And then I can observe actual worker behavior. And this will allow me to check the box on the causal identification that I'd been constantly, my training at UCLA just kept pushing me to sort of figure out how you can get causal identification, And it took me sort of having to step away from some of the more common CSR data sets and come up with a different angle, essentially, to try to get at that. And so that's what I did. I used these platforms. I applied for a grant. Because I'm essentially paying people to do jobs. So I applied for the Strategy Research Foundation dissertation grant, which was huge in funding me to be able to do this research, essentially. And that basically became the focus of my dissertation. It then became my job market paper. My job market paper was looking at how CSR messaging influences the wages that workers were willing to accept on these platforms. And then since then, I have done a lot of these. I mean, I'm fascinated by online labor marketplaces. I'm constantly looking at what the new ones are, how they could be used. And I feel like every paper that I write sort of takes my old experimental sort of overall platform design and like improves it in some way. And I've just found it, for me, just a really, really exciting setting and platform to be able to do this kind of causal research that was really hard to do on the topics that I was interested in. And I have to say, I credit the sort of the UCLA program sort of insistence on causal identification in a way, like we talked about, it's entrepreneurial. I had to come up with the actual idea on my own, but without that pushing, would I have, continued to look until I came up with this? Maybe not. So, and it's been really rewarding for me. I've gotten a lot of published a lot of papers using this methodology now. I teach it to other PhD students, and it's been really fun.
So interesting. So let me just maybe take a sidebar on this particular topic, because this aspect of your research has made you kind of a leader in methodology, or a pioneer in methodology, at least for the strategy field. What other topics can this methodology be applied for? And I kind of asked this question on behalf of the doctoral students here, and maybe the doctoral students who will be watching online. One would not normally think of corporate social responsibility as a topic on which one could do experiments of this type, and yet that's what you do. And so it makes me think that if we don't normally think of CSR as a topic that this methodology would apply to, then maybe there's numerous other topics that we wouldn't normally think of this methodology applying to. What do you think? What are the boundaries on which one might apply this? What are the opportunities? What are the opportunities?
Yeah, so I think that I think the main boundary is that your outcome variable of interest should be something that is basically a behavioral sort of employee focused variable that you can observe. So anything from productivity, wages, amount of characteristics of the work that are done. There's all sorts of opportunity. I haven't done this yet, but I've been thinking about, opportunities to do textual analysis on communications between employer and employee to sort of characterize things in different ways. But really anything that looks at sort of an employee behavior. You can even do sort of, you can even construct kind of teamwork types of interactions via these platforms. And again, I have not done this, but I think there's absolutely opportunities you could construct teams of people working together in ways, I don't know, if you're interested in gender, you could sort of vary the gender or diversity of the teams. You could vary all sorts of other things on sort of a team setting. And then the other thing that I think is really quote unquote easy to vary on and do random assignment on these platforms is basically any organizational characteristic or employer characteristic that lends itself to something that can be communicated in some way or represented in some way on these platforms can be manipulated because, I look at CSR related types of issues and social political stances types of issues, but you could communicate all sorts of things about an employer on these platforms. And so I think it's sort of creativity is the limit to an extent. I do think that the outcomes determine a little bit more what makes sense to study because you can't, you can observe what workers do, you can observe how they communicate with you, and so you can construct all sorts of outcome variables around that. But if you weren't interested in studying sort of employee behavior in some way, then these particular labor market platforms probably wouldn't lend themselves that well to it. But I'll also say, and sort of I give this sort of spiel when I talk about online platforms as settings for field experiments more broadly, that I focus on these labor related platforms because of my research interests, because I'm so interested in sort of employee motivation and human capital management and things like that. But the sort of essence of what makes these types of platforms really exciting from a research perspective also applies to other types of two-sided platforms out there. The idea is that you have one side matched with another side. You can randomly assign characteristics of this one side of the platform and observe actual behavior of the other side of the platform. So in the labor market platforms, it makes sense that you have the employer here and the employee or worker on the other side. But there are all sorts of other two-sided platforms out there where you could imagine doing something similar and observing, a different type of outcome on the other side. So it depends a little bit what your research interests are. But the exciting thing about these platforms is it allows you to do random assignment, which is so hard in our field to be able to do. And there's even some benefits to the extent that, if you think about doing random assignment, for example, in kind of a firm setting or something like that, you worry about treatment effect diffusion. You worry about like employees talking to each other about whatever it is that you were trying to randomly assign. Whereas on these platforms, because the individuals on one side do not communicate with each other, they're completely separate beyond what you might put them together as. You don't have things like treatment effect diffusion concerning you in your study. So yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. For anyone who's interested, what I recommend is basically going on the platform, signing up as both of the sides, like making an account on both sides, and then going in and sort of seeing how the platform works. Because as you go through the steps, I think you get ideas about, oh, this is something that I could vary, or, oh, this is information that I could download and use as a moderating variable or as a mediating variable or something like that. And a lot of my ideas come from basically playing around on these platforms and trying to figure out what information there is and how it can be used.
Very interesting. So, excuse me. So is this a methodology that potentially could be used to do research that would speak to, let's say, mergers and acquisitions, alliances, vertical integration, entrepreneurship, any of these topics?
So I think definitely entrepreneurship, because there's a number of sort of entrepreneurship related platforms out there. the crowdfunding platforms, for example. I haven't really thought in depth about how one would go about doing that, but there are these two-sided platforms that play a big role in entrepreneurship that I imagine, one could think about leveraging in some way. Mergers and acquisitions is probably tougher. I can't think of a platform that would allow you to sort of certainly to observe it as an outcome.
No, right.
It would be tough, but you could probably you could consider, if what you care about is something like, well, what happens when sort of the cultures of two firms merge and how that influences employees. That I think you could imagine constructing in this type of setting. So you would think about how to communicate them separately and then together. And so those types of things I think you could kind of proxy and get at.
Right. So strategic human capital issues in M&A, right? Yes. So things like turnover,
yes.
Um,
motivation, productivity. Yes, absolutely.
Right. And how about obviously there's big literatures on reputation and status and networks.
Certainly networks, I think could something on networks, I think could be, you could imagine constructing, because you can also construct you can construct the networks in some way. You can kind of form teams. You could sort of manipulate how you set up these interactions and then observe the product that comes out the other end, like how creative is the output or something like that. That could be something interesting to look at. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I think the trick is sort of coming up with is there a way to randomly assign or manipulate the aspect of this construct in a sort of communication based portal, and then look at the outcomes on the other side. And if there's a way to sort of take something like, oh, what we're interested in is say M&A, we can't randomly assign mergers and acquisitions, but we can take sort of that construct and look at something specific, like how competing cultures of organizations influence outcomes or something like that. So you can think of sort of going to sort of the maybe a proximal step in the theory process and then testing that part of it for some of these things that are just bigger than you might otherwise think these platforms could lend themselves to.
You should probably develop like an online workshop or something, or a PDW or something where doctoral students and junior researchers could bring ideas about how to apply, or questions at least about how to apply this technique to their own research interests and get feedback.
I'll thanks for the suggestion. I'll definitely think about that. I do, when I present on field experiments broadly, I usually talk about this particular type. But I haven't thought about doing something specific on it. I do sort of advise, like, ad hoc PhD students will reach out to me and say, I'm taking your methodology and I'm trying to explore it into something that I'm interested in. And I'm always happy to talk. I always say yes to those types of requests.
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, we are in a field that focuses on competitive advantage and what unique value, we bring. And that probably is something really unique that nobody else really can offer to this field at this point, or very few. So it would be your competitive advantage to bring that. So okay, so I usually ask my interviewees what was the biggest challenge in doing their dissertation project, although it sounds like you've kind of answered that question already with this struggle that you had in transitioning from the standard CSR databases to this other methodology. But let me ask, aside from that, were there any other major challenges that you faced in the dissertation project? And if so, how did you overcome them?
I think that was probably the toughest for me. And then it was also just time management. I had my first child in the middle of the PhD program, and that was certainly something I had not been prepared for. Didn't really know how to sort of, you go from spending all of your time thinking about research and working on research as a PhD student to then I had this sort of really huge other time commitment that I had to sort of have to figure out how to balance those things. In a strange way, I actually think, once I had my kids, it focused my hours. Like, I just couldn't allow myself to think about research all the time. I had to put boundaries on my time. And in a way, I actually think that helped me. I don't know. I think PhD students, and maybe this is just my own experience, but you feel like you should be working on research all the time. And that is a tough thing to sustain for 5 or 6 years without burning out or really, or not having your good perspective on your own research. And so I found, after my son was born, I had to restrict the time that I was able to spend on my work. I had to be a little bit more efficient in what I spent my time doing when it came to research. So I became a little bit more focused. I had to make tougher decisions about what conferences I would or wouldn't go to and things like that. So I think that was beyond sort of the challenge topic wise in terms of trying to come up with a methodology that was well identified. I'd say that was the other big challenge during my.
So this was literally during your dissertation process that you had
my fourth year
transformation in your life. Yeah.
In my fourth year of the PhD program.
Wow. Yeah, that is a challenging time to have a complete transition to your home life. Yeah. So, okay. Well, another question I like to ask people is, what are the most important unanswered questions in your particular field of your particular topic area? So defining, I'll take a cue from your webpage, you define your topic area as, multiple topic areas. So maybe we take them one at a time. Socially responsible and irresponsible business. What are the most important unanswered questions on that topic that what do we not know at this point that we really ought to know?
So I'll tell you something that that's very related to that I've been really excited about in recent years, which is it's related to social responsibility, but you might say it's a little bit distinct, which is this surgence of companies taking stances on social political issues. This is sort of a newish phenomenon. Maybe one of the first to do this was Chick-fil-A back, you may remember a few years ago, taking a stance against gay marriage. Starbucks took a stance sort of in favor of gay marriage. You had companies taking stances both for and against Trump's removal of the US from the Paris Accord, so things related to climate change. And then we have just since then seen a lot of this, even in more recent years, we've even been seeing this phenomenon of companies taking public stances in favor or against political candidates, which is also something that just didn't happen before. Companies would donate and maybe lobby, but this sort of taking a stance, a public stance in front of your consumers and the public and your employees on behalf of a political candidate is something that's really, really new. And we just know so little about what the implications of companies doing this are. So I've been really interested from an employee perspective in terms of how it influences employee motivation and morale. And my management science paper from last year was focused on that. But it's one of the very first ones. So, Mike Toffel and Ronnie Chatterjee have been thinking about this issue. They refer to it as CEO activism. I think it's a really nascent sort of emerging phenomenon that we don't know as strategy scholars what the implications are from a strategic perspective. Is this good for companies? Is this bad for companies? Under what conditions? How do people respond? Is there a way that is there a way to sort of construct these types of statements or think about what the boundary conditions are or contingencies are for when it is good versus bad from a motivation perspective or a strategic sort of implications perspective more broadly. And so I think that topic I think is really exciting, and there's just so much to do there because it just hasn't been studied. So that to me, I think, is one of the most exciting things related to CSR in this kind of era that we're living in now. The world's kind of become more politicized, and so what are the implications of these types of things?
Nice. Okay. Yeah, that is a wide open topic. Absolutely. Yeah, and it's timely. So you also mentioned the meaningfulness at work as another research interest. Are there unanswered research questions on that topic that you would like to see more knowledge about?
Yeah. So one thing that I think is fascinating is is just thinking about how all these things that we know about worker motivation might change with sort of this transition to a new type of work. So some people would say there's a new future of work. You know, we're all on Zoom now. Um, a lot of working from home, working remotely. We hope to return to a world where we're all in person again, but there are probably a lot of aspects that have shifted in this pandemic that are not going to completely go away. And the increase of sort of more remote work, more gig work is likely to be one of those trends that we'll sort of continue to see in the future. And so I think it's really interesting to think about, well, what, you know, all these things that we know about meaning that individuals derive from work and things like that, does that change in a context where you're sort of physically separated from your employer? Or physically, you know, physically distant from your coworkers. And how do we think about that? And how are companies that might want to have less of an in-person presence and more of an online presence, less of physical store, you know, less of a physical office and more of sort of an online virtual office, what should we be telling them about worker motivation and how to keep people engaged in this era that's going to be a little bit different from you know, company culture is sort of defined in a lot of ways by the physical space and your interactions with others and sort of the logo of the company that you see when you walk in the door and things like that. And so what does that mean for worker motivation and meaningfulness at work more broadly when we think about this change in the future of work?
Very interesting. Yeah, I think that's right. That is going to be a key topic at least for a while. I don't know, you know, I suspect that some things will not go back to normal, you know,
Right.
Because, you know, we're all just simply because we all now know how to operate on, you know, in distance mode in a way that we didn't know before. So we've kind of been forced to train ourselves up in something that did exist, but you know, we didn't really all have the motivation to do it. And so, you know, I suspect a lot, you know, there'll be a lot less travel for sales calls and stuff like that. And so yeah, so some of this is permanent, I think.
Yeah.
And beneficial, you know?
Yeah, and certainly for like nascent startups, entrepreneurial organizations, I can see a world where, particularly for new ventures, they no longer feel constrained to hire people who are, you know, like in their geographic area. It sort of opens up a different way potentially of working, particularly for new ventures, I think.
Yeah, I mean, and there are some ways in which the, you know, there has this experience has opened up greater opportunities for having impact than we've had in the past. I mean, you know, before we started the interview, Luis and I were talking about, well, what do we do with these pro seminar interviews once we can now invite people to actually physical campus visits? What are we going to do about that? Because, you know, this YouTube series has allowed us to have a pretty broad and big impact on the field, and you know, not something we would really want to give up. But at the same time, it would be kind of weird to invite someone to physically come to campus and then interview them on Zoom. You know, so we have
to in another room and on a laptop.
Yeah, we have to think about what are we going to do once the world gets more back to normal. That, you know, how can we preserve some of the good things that have come out of this? Yeah, and that's going to be that's going to be some interesting topic for discussion for us, at least. Yeah. So yeah, so have you been involved much in the PhD program at Columbia?
Yes, I work closely with a number of PhD students there. I teach the pro seminar. I'm teaching it this year, and yeah, our PhDs at Columbia are great. They're really great, and they're a lot of fun to work with.
Nice. So, what's the most important piece of advice that you give to the PhD students at Columbia?
So I always tell people, based on my own, and this is based on my own personal experience. So I also tell people, the PhD students, they should take all advice from faculty with a grain of salt, because it all comes from one's individual experience, and that varies by person. But I always tell people that I think one of the most important things is to stay true to what it is that you want to do. I think that sometimes you can be kind of diverted by, what your advisor does, or what faculty around you are doing, or what data sets are available can sometimes like define what you end up making your research agenda. And in my experience, it has been way more fun and more rewarding to say, no, this is what I want to study. I'm going to figure out a way to study it well. Because you spend so much time on it that if you don't really, really, really enjoy it and find it really interesting, it's just hard to do. I mean, the publication process is a slog, and and you will get rejections, and you'll have to bounce back from them. And even if you don't get rejections, the publication process still takes years. And so, being able to sort of stay excited about papers, I think, comes from a place of just doing what it is that you're really passionate about. So that's sort of the main advice that I give my students. I say the rest of it we'll teach you how to do good empirical work. We'll teach you how to network. We'll give you advice on sort of what to do at conferences and things like that. But the thing that we can't tell you, that you have to figure out yourself, is, well, what is my topic of interest going to be, and what type of scholar do I want to be going forward? And then the rest we can help with.
Well, great. That's great advice, and something that I usually echo myself. And we have gone a little bit longer than I expected. So first of all, please join me in thanking Vanessa for participating in our pro-seminar ritual.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.